Sandra Johnson sat in her car outside the Pinecrest Medical Center, her heart pounding in her chest. The sharp pains she'd been experiencing for weeks were now impossible to ignore. As she looked up at the imposing hospital building, she felt a wave of anxiety wash over her. She had never felt so vulnerable, and the fear of what might be wrong with her heart was overwhelming. But what scared her even more was the thought that she might not be taken seriously. She had heard stories, whispered warnings from friends and family, about how Black women were often dismissed by the medical establishment, their pain and concerns brushed aside. But she pushed those thoughts to the back of her mind. This was Pinecrest, a top-tier medical facility, and Dr. Alan Spencer was one of the best cardiologists in the state. He would listen. He had to. As Sandra walked into the sterile, brightly lit corridors of the hospital, she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. The receptionist greeted her with a polite but distant smile as she confirmed her appointment. Sandra took a seat in the waiting area, clutching her purse tightly in her lap, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. The moments dragged by, each second amplifying her anxiety. She noticed the other patients, most of them older and white, being called in one by one, their names spoken with warmth and familiarity. When her name was finally called, the nurse's tone was neutral, almost perfunctory. Sandra stood up, took a deep breath, and followed the nurse down the hallway. Dr. Spencer's office was large and immaculate, but devoid of any personal touches. Medical degrees lined the walls, along with various awards and commendations. Sandra tried to draw comfort from the credentials staring back at her, reminding herself that she was in capable hands. As she entered, Dr. Spencer, a tall man in his late 50s with graying hair and a stern expression, didn't bother to look up from his computer. His voice was clipped and formal as he gestured for her to take a seat. "Mrs. Johnson, what seems to be the problem today?" Sandra hesitated for a moment, then began to describe her symptoms. "I've been having these sharp pains in my chest, and it's been getting worse. I'm also short of breath, even when I'm not doing anything strenuous. I'm really worried it might be something serious, like a heart issue." She tried to keep her voice steady, but the fear crept in, making her words tremble slightly. Dr. Spencer finally looked up, his eyes briefly scanning her before returning to his screen. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, then leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "It sounds like you might be experiencing some stress or anxiety, Mrs. Johnson. It's quite common, especially with everything going on in the world these days. I wouldn't worry too much about it. Have you considered taking some time off work to relax?" Sandra blinked, stunned by his response. She had been so sure that he would take her seriously, that he would run tests or at least ask more questions. But the way he dismissed her concerns so easily, without even a second thought, made her feel invisible. "But this doesn't feel like stress," she insisted, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. "The pain is real, and it's not going away. I really think it needs to be looked into." Dr. Spencer sighed, his patience visibly thinning. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been doing this for a long time. I can assure you that if there was something wrong with your heart, the symptoms would be more severe. There's no need to jump to conclusions. Stress can manifest in physical ways that feel very real, but it's not life-threatening. I suggest you focus on managing your stress levels and getting plenty of rest." The room seemed to close in on Sandra as he spoke. The indifference in his tone, the way he barely glanced at her, made her feel like a child being scolded for overreacting. She felt her anger rising, a hot, churning fury mixed with helplessness. But what could she do? He was the expert, the one with all the knowledge and experience. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Sandra left the office with a sense of disbelief. How could a doctor, someone she trusted with her health, dismiss her so easily? She felt tears stinging her eyes as she walked out of the hospital. The pain in her chest was still there, gnawing at her, but now it was accompanied by a heavy weight of doubt and fear. She had been ignored, her concerns pushed aside like they didn't matter. As she reached her car, she sat down heavily in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the steering wheel. How many others had been treated the same way? How many had suffered because they weren't taken seriously? Over the next few days, Sandra's frustration grew into something more, a desperate need for answers. The chest pain hadn't subsided. In fact, it seemed to be getting worse. But the memory of Dr. Spencer's dismissive attitude made her doubt herself. Was it all in her head? Was she really just stressed, as he had so condescendingly suggested? She spent hours scouring the internet, reading about heart disease and the risks, especially for Black women. The statistics were alarming, but what terrified her most was the thought that she might be right, that something could be seriously wrong, and yet she had been dismissed by the very person who was supposed to help her. Her husband, James, was the one who finally convinced her to seek a second opinion. Sandra, you know your body better than anyone else. If you think something's wrong, then it probably is. You can't let one doctor's opinion stop you from getting the care you need. His words were firm but gentle, and they resonated with the fear and doubt that had been gnawing at her since the appointment. James had always been her rock, steady and supportive, and she knew he was right. She couldn't let Dr. Spencer's arrogance dictate her health. With James by her side, Sandra made an appointment with Dr. Emily Carter, a cardiologist recommended by a close friend. Dr. Carter's office was in a smaller, more intimate clinic, far removed from the cold, impersonal atmosphere of Pinecrest. As Sandra and James walked in, they were greeted with warm smiles and a sense of genuine care that immediately put them at ease. The receptionist was friendly, the waiting room was cozy, and the overall environment was one of welcome and attentiveness. Dr. Carter, a woman in her early 40s with a calm demeanor and an approachable smile, welcomed Sandra into her office with a handshake and a reassuring nod. "Mrs. Johnson, it's nice to meet you. I understand you've been having some troubling symptoms. Why don't you tell me what's been going on?" Her voice was soothing, and the way she looked directly at Sandra made her feel like she was truly being seen and heard. As Sandra described the chest pain and shortness of breath, Dr. Carter listened intently, nodding and making notes but never interrupting. When Sandra mentioned her previous appointment with Dr. Spencer and how he had dismissed her concerns, Dr. Carter's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested she wasn't surprised. "I'm sorry you had that experience, Sandra," Dr. Carter said gently, "but you were right to come for a second opinion. Your symptoms are concerning, and we need to take them seriously." Sandra felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was acknowledging her fears, validating what she had known in her gut all along. Dr. Carter explained that while stress could indeed cause physical symptoms, it was crucial to rule out any serious conditions, especially given Sandra's symptoms. She outlined a plan that included an electrocardiogram, EKG, a stress test, and some blood work to get a comprehensive understanding of what was going on with Sandra's heart. As the tests were scheduled, Sandra couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief that she was finally being taken seriously, but also fear about what the tests might reveal. She knew there was a chance the results could confirm her worst fears, but she also knew that ignoring the problem wasn't an option. Dr. Carter's calm and methodical approach gave her confidence, and for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was on the right path. James held Sandra's hand as they left the clinic, his grip firm and comforting. "We're going to get through this," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Sandra nodded, grateful for his unwavering support. She had been so close to giving up, to letting Dr. Spencer's dismissal dictate her fate, but now she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for her health, she was fighting for her dignity, for the right to be heard and treated with respect. As they drove home, Sandra's thoughts drifted back to Dr. Spencer. The anger she had felt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. How many other patients had he dismissed? How many lives had been put at risk because of his arrogance? The thought made her stomach churn. She knew she couldn't let it go. Dr. Carter had given her the care she deserved, but Dr. Spencer needed to be held accountable for his actions. Sandra wasn't just going to fight for herself. She was going to fight for every patient who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or belittled by the people they trusted to care for them. The tests were conducted over the next few days, each one a nerve-wracking experience for Sandra. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, suspended between the fear of what might be discovered and the hope that it could be managed. Dr. Carter had assured her that whatever the outcome, they would face it together, and that promise was the only thing keeping Sandra's anxiety at bay. When the day finally came for her to receive the results, Sandra could hardly breathe from the tension. She and James sat in Dr. Carter's office, holding hands tightly as they waited for the doctor to enter. Sandra's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of why she was there. When Dr. Carter walked in, her face was calm but serious, and Sandra braced herself for what was coming. "Sandra, I'm glad you came to see me," Dr. Carter began, her voice steady. "The test confirmed what we suspected. You have a significant blockage in one of your coronary arteries. This is what's been causing your symptoms, and it's something we need to address right away." Sandra felt the world tilt slightly, her mind struggling to process the information. A blockage? The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't something she could simply rest away. This was real and it was serious. James squeezed her hand, grounding her as she fought to keep her composure. Dr. Carter continued, explaining the treatment options. "We're going to start you on medication to manage the condition, but given the severity of the blockage, we'll also need to consider a procedure to remove it. The good news is that we've caught it in time. With the right treatment, we can manage this and get you back to feeling healthy again." Tears welled up in Sandra's eyes, a mixture of relief and fear. Relief that she finally had answers, but fear of what lay ahead. The thought that she had been so close to ignoring the symptoms, that Dr. Spencer's dismissal could have led her to a much worse outcome, was terrifying. She couldn't believe how close she had come to a disaster simply because someone had refused to listen to her. Dr. Carter was gentle but firm as she went over the next steps. She explained the procedure in detail, answering all of Sandra's questions with patience and clarity. Sandra felt grateful for her compassion, for the way she treated her with dignity and respect. This was what healthcare was supposed to be: collaborative, informed, and caring. It was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she had experienced with Dr. Spencer. As they left the office, Sandra felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Dr. Carter, but also a deep anger towards Dr. Spencer. How many other women had sat in his office, their concerns dismissed as hysteria or overreaction? How many lives had been jeopardized by his arrogance? Sandra knew she couldn't stay silent. She had to take action, not just for herself, but for every patient who had been dismissed and disregarded. And then that night, as Sandra and James sat together in their living room, she voiced the decision that had been forming in her mind. "I'm going to file a complaint against Dr. Spencer," she said, her voice steady with conviction. James nodded, his expression supportive but serious. "I think that's the right thing to do. He needs to be held accountable, Sandra. What he did was wrong, and it could have cost you your life." Sandra felt a surge of determination. She wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it for all the others who had been silenced, who had been told their pain didn't matter. It was time to make sure that doctors like Dr. Spencer were held accountable for their actions, and that patients like her were treated with the respect and care they deserved. The decision to file a formal complaint against Dr. Spencer wasn't one that Sandra took lightly. She knew it would be a difficult and potentially lengthy process, but she was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about her own experience. It was about standing up against a system that too often dismissed the concerns of Black women, treating them as less important, less worthy of care. Sandra began by gathering all the necessary documentation. She requested copies of her medical records from both Dr. Spencer and Dr. Carter, making sure to include detailed notes about her symptoms, Dr. Spencer's dismissal, and the eventual diagnosis and treatment she received from Dr. Carter. She also took the time to write a detailed account of her interactions with Dr. Spencer, carefully outlining how he had disregarded her concerns and failed to provide the necessary care. Once she had all the information, Sandra sat down to write her complaint. It was an emotional process, forcing her to relive the frustration, fear, and anger she had felt during her initial appointment with Dr. Spencer. But she knew it was important to be thorough and precise. She described how Dr. Spencer had dismissed her symptoms as stress without conducting any tests, how he had minimized her concerns, and how his negligence had nearly led to a life-threatening situation. She also included a comparison of the care she received from Dr. Carter, highlighting the stark difference in how she was treated by a doctor who truly listened and cared. When the complaint was finally written, Sandra submitted it to the hospital's patient advocacy office. She knew that the process could take time, but she was prepared to fight for as long as it took. James was by her side every step of the way, offering his support and encouragement. He knew how much this meant to Sandra, and he was determined to help her in any way he could. As the days passed, Sandra tried to focus on her health and the upcoming procedure to address the blockage in her artery, but the weight of the complaint and the memories of her encounter with Dr. Spencer were never far from her mind. She knew that filing the complaint was the right thing to do, but it didn't make the waiting any easier. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for all the others who had been mistreated, dismissed, and ignored. Finally, Sandra received a letter from the hospital's patient advocacy office, informing her that her complaint had been received and that an investigation would be conducted. The letter outlined the steps of the investigation, including interviews with both Dr. Spencer and Dr. Carter, as well as a review of Sandra's medical records. It was a small victory, but it gave Sandra hope that her voice was being heard. The investigation process was thorough, and Sandra was interviewed multiple times by hospital administrators. They asked her detailed questions about her experience, and she answered them as honestly and clearly as she could. She knew that this was her chance to make a difference, to hold Dr. Spencer accountable for his actions. The administrators also spoke with Dr. Carter, who corroborated Sandra's account and provided additional insight into the seriousness of her condition and the care she received. As the investigation continued, Sandra's determination only grew stronger. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every patient who had been mistreated, for every Black woman who had been dismissed and ignored by the healthcare system. She knew that her actions could help bring about change, and she was willing to do whatever it took to see that change happen. James was a constant source of support during this time, reminding Sandra that she was doing the right thing. He knew how difficult it was for her to relive the experience, but he also knew how important it was for her to stand up for herself and for others. Together, they navigated the ups and downs of the investigation, holding on to the hope that justice would be served. The day finally came when Sandra received a call from the hospital informing her that the investigation had been completed. The administrator on the other end of the line was respectful and empathetic, acknowledging the pain and frustration Sandra had experienced. They informed her that Dr. Spencer had been found to have acted inappropriately and that disciplinary action would be taken against him. While the specifics of the action were not disclosed, Sandra felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had been heard and her complaint had made a difference. Although the news that Dr. Spencer would face disciplinary action brought Sandra some measure of satisfaction, it did little to erase the emotional scars left by the entire ordeal. The procedure to clear the blockage in her artery was a success, and she was slowly regaining her strength. But the experience with Dr. Spencer had shaken her deeply. It had made her question not only the healthcare system, but also her place within it. How many more would suffer simply because their concerns were dismissed out of hand? Sandra decided that she couldn't let her story end here. The complaint was a start, but it wasn't enough. She felt a growing need to share her experience, to raise awareness about the biases that still existed in the medical field, especially against Black women. She began reaching out to local community groups and advocacy organizations, telling them her story and encouraging others to come forward with their own experiences. Word of Sandra's story began to spread. It resonated with many who had experienced similar treatment, and soon she found herself speaking at community meetings and health forums. Her voice, once silenced by fear and doubt, now carried the weight of authority and experience. She was determined to use her platform to push for change, to ensure that what had happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. One day, Sandra was approached by a journalist who had heard about her story and wanted to write an article highlighting the issue of racial bias in healthcare. At first, Sandra was hesitant. She wasn't sure if she wanted to expose herself to that kind of public scrutiny. But after discussing it with James, she realized that sharing her story on a larger scale could make a significant impact. The article was published in a well-known magazine, sparking a wave of conversation and bringing the issue of healthcare discrimination into the spotlight. The response was overwhelming. Sandra received letters and emails from people across the country who had gone through similar experiences. Many of them expressed gratitude for her courage in speaking out, while others shared their own stories of being dismissed or mistreated by medical professionals. It was both heartening and heartbreaking to see just how widespread the problem was. Sandra knew that there was still so much work to be done. As the movement grew, Sandra became more involved in advocacy work. She joined a national organization dedicated to addressing healthcare disparities and began working with policymakers to push for reforms. Her story was shared at conferences and workshops, serving as a powerful example of why change was needed. Through it all, James remained by her side, offering his unwavering support and encouragement. Dr. Spencer, meanwhile, was undergoing his own reckoning. The disciplinary action taken against him forced him to confront the biases that had influenced his treatment of Sandra and likely many other patients. He was required to undergo training on cultural competency and implicit bias, as well as to participate in a mentorship program where he would be paired with a more empathetic and inclusive healthcare provider. It was a humbling experience, one that made him question his entire approach to medicine. The training sessions were eye-opening for Dr. Spencer. He had always prided himself on his medical expertise, but now he realized that knowledge alone wasn't enough. Being a good doctor also required empathy, the ability to listen, and a commitment to treating every patient with respect and dignity. The process of self-reflection was difficult, but it was necessary if he wanted to become the kind of doctor his patients deserved. As Dr. Spencer worked through his training and mentorship, he began to see the ways in which his biases had impacted his practice. He recognized that he had often dismissed the concerns of patients who didn't fit his preconceived notions of who was serious or worthy of care. The realization was painful, but it was also a catalyst for change. Dr. Spencer knew that he had to do better, not just for himself, but for his patients and the community he served. Sandra and Dr. Spencer's paths crossed again when the hospital organized a panel discussion on racial bias in healthcare. Sandra was invited to speak, and Dr. Spencer, now fully aware of the consequences of his actions, was in the audience. As Sandra shared her story with the room full of healthcare professionals, she could feel the tension in the air. She didn't hold back, speaking with passion and conviction about the need for systemic change. After the panel, Dr. Spencer approached Sandra. His expression was somber, and there was no trace of the arrogance she had encountered during their first meeting. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice sincere, "I want to apologize for how I treated you. I was wrong, and I'm deeply sorry. I've learned a lot since then, and I'm committed to being a better doctor, one who listens and respects his patients." Sandra looked at him for a moment, her emotions a mix of anger, sadness, and a glimmer of hope. She nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dr. Spencer. I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about me. It's about making sure that no one else has to go through what I did. I hope you'll keep that in mind as you move forward." Dr. Spencer nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. "I will, Mrs. Johnson, I promise." As Sandra continued her advocacy work, she found that it brought her a sense of purpose and healing that she hadn't expected. Sharing her story, connecting with others who had been through similar experiences, and pushing for change all helped her process the trauma she had endured. She was no longer just a victim of a flawed system. She was a catalyst for change, using her voice to make a difference. The success of her advocacy efforts led to invitations to speak at national conferences and to participate in panels discussing healthcare reform. Sandra was initially nervous about stepping onto such large platforms, but with James's encouragement, she embraced the opportunity. Each time she shared her story, she felt a little stronger, a little more empowered. She knew that her voice was making an impact, that her words were helping to shift the narrative around healthcare disparities. Through her work, Sandra also found herself connecting with other women of color who had faced similar challenges in the healthcare system. These connections were deeply meaningful, offering a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Together, they formed a network of support, sharing resources, advice, and encouragement. Sandra was grateful for these new friendships, which gave her the strength to keep fighting, even when the journey was difficult. One of the most significant outcomes of Sandra's efforts was the creation of a task force at Pinecrest Medical Center dedicated to addressing racial disparities in patient care. The task force, which included doctors, nurses, administrators, and community members, was charged with reviewing hospital policies and practices, providing bias training for staff, and ensuring that all patients received equitable treatment. Sandra was invited to serve as a consultant for the task force, a role she accepted with pride. Working with the task force allowed Sandra to see firsthand the impact of her advocacy. Changes were being made, policies were being revised, and healthcare providers were being held accountable. It was a long and challenging process, but Sandra felt hopeful that real progress was being made. She was particularly encouraged by the younger doctors and medical students who were eager to learn and committed to providing compassionate, patient-centered care. As the months passed, Sandra's health continued to improve. She followed Dr. Carter's treatment plan diligently, and her condition was well managed. The fear and uncertainty that had once dominated her life began to fade, replaced by a sense of resilience and determination. She had faced a life-threatening condition, but she had also found her voice, her purpose, and a new sense of self. James remained her steadfast supporter, celebrating each victory with her, no matter how small. Their bond grew stronger as they navigated the challenges and triumphs together. James often reminded Sandra of how far she had come, how much she had achieved. He knew that the journey hadn't been easy, but he was incredibly proud of the woman his wife had become, strong, fearless, and determined to make a difference. Despite the progress that had been made, Sandra knew that there was still much work to be done. Healthcare disparities were deeply rooted, and systemic change would take time. But she was committed to the cause, determined to keep pushing for reform until every patient, regardless of race, gender, or background, received the care they deserved. As Sandra looked back on her journey, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the doctors like Dr. Carter, who had listened and cared, gratitude for the community that had supported her, and gratitude for the strength she had found within herself. She knew that her story was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next with courage and determination. Dr. Spencer, too, continued his journey of growth and self-reflection. The experience with Sandra had been a wake-up call, forcing him to confront the biases that had shaped his practice. He was determined to do better, to be the kind of doctor who listened, who cared, and who treated every patient with the respect they deserved. It was a long road, but he was committed to the journey. As Sandra's story gained national attention, she was invited to join a coalition of advocates working to address healthcare disparities at the policy level. The coalition, which included doctors, patients, activists, and policymakers, was focused on pushing for legislative reforms that would improve access to quality healthcare for all, particularly marginalized communities. Sandra's role in the coalition was to share her story and to advocate for policies that would ensure that no one else had to go through what she had experienced. The work was demanding, but Sandra was passionate about it. She spent countless hours meeting with lawmakers, attending hearings, and speaking at rallies. She quickly became a respected voice in the movement, known for her eloquence, her courage, and her unwavering commitment to justice. Sandra was proud to be part of such important work, knowing that the changes they were fighting for could save lives. One of the key issues the coalition focused on was the need for better training for healthcare providers on cultural competency and implicit bias. Sandra knew firsthand how dangerous it could be when doctors failed to listen to their patients, and she was determined to ensure that future generations of healthcare providers were better equipped to treat all patients with the care and respect they deserved. The coalition pushed for mandatory bias training in medical schools and healthcare institutions, as well as the creation of accountability measures to ensure that providers were held responsible for their actions. As the movement grew, Sandra found herself traveling across the country, speaking to audiences of all sizes about her experience and the need for systemic change. Each time she shared her story, she was reminded of the importance of the work she was doing. She knew that her voice was making a difference, that her words were inspiring others to take action. It was a powerful feeling, one that gave her the strength to keep going, even when the fight seemed overwhelming. Through her advocacy, Sandra also began to connect with other patients who had been mistreated or dismissed by the healthcare system. These conversations were often emotional, but they also reinforced Sandra's belief that change was possible. She listened to their stories, offered support and advice, and encouraged them to speak out. Sandra knew that her story was just one of many, and she was determined to use her platform to amplify the voices of others who had been silenced. As Sandra's work continued, she began to see the impact of the coalition's efforts. Several states passed legislation requiring bias training for healthcare providers, and medical schools across the country began to incorporate cultural competency into their curricula. These were significant victories, but Sandra knew that the work was far from over. She remained committed to the cause, determined to keep fighting for as long as it took to create a healthcare system that was truly equitable and just. Despite the demands of her advocacy work, Sandra made sure to prioritize her own health and well-being. She continued to follow Dr. Carter's treatment plan and attended regular checkups to monitor her condition. Her health remained stable, and she was grateful for the care she received. Dr. Carter had become more than just a doctor to Sandra. She was a trusted ally, someone who had listened when no one else would. Sandra often thought about how different her life might have been if she hadn't sought a second opinion, if she had allowed Dr. Spencer's dismissal to dictate her fate. James continued to be Sandra's rock, supporting her in every aspect of her work. He traveled with her when he could, attended her speaking engagements, and provided a listening ear when she needed to talk through her thoughts and feelings. Their relationship had deepened through the challenges they had faced together, and Sandra was grateful every day for the love and support he provided. As Sandra reflected on her journey, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned a moment of pain and injustice into a powerful force for change, and she knew that her work was making a difference. But she also knew that the fight was far from over. There were still countless patients who needed to be heard, who needed advocates like her to stand up and speak out on their behalf. Sandra was ready to continue the fight, knowing that every step forward brought them closer to the goal of a healthcare system that truly served everyone. Sandra's advocacy work continued to grow, reaching new heights as she became a national figure in the fight against healthcare disparities. Her story had inspired countless others to come forward, and the movement she had helped to spark was gaining momentum. Sandra was invited to speak at some of the most prestigious medical conferences in the country, where she shared her story with doctors, medical students, and healthcare leaders. Her message was clear: the healthcare system needed to change, and it was up to those within the system to make it happen. As Sandra traveled the country, she began to see the ripple effects of her work. Healthcare institutions were taking notice, implementing new policies and practices aimed at addressing the very issues Sandra had been fighting against. Bias training was becoming more common, and more healthcare providers were beginning to recognize the importance of cultural competency in their practice. These changes were incremental, but they were significant, and Sandra knew that they were a direct result of the advocacy she and others like her had been doing. One of the most rewarding aspects of Sandra's work was seeing the impact it had on individual patients. She often received letters and emails from people who had read about her story or heard her speak. Many of them shared their own experiences of being dismissed or mistreated by the healthcare system, and they expressed gratitude for the work Sandra was doing. These messages were a source of strength for Sandra, reminding her of why she had started this journey in the first place. Sandra's work also began to attract the attention of policymakers at the federal level. She was invited to testify before Congress about her experience and the need for legislative reforms to address healthcare disparities. It was a daunting prospect, but Sandra knew that this was an opportunity to make a real difference. She spent weeks preparing her testimony, working with experts to ensure that she could effectively convey the urgency of the issue. When the day finally came, Sandra stood before the committee with confidence, her voice steady as she spoke about the need for systemic change. The testimony was well received, and it led to a renewed push for healthcare reform at the national level. Sandra was encouraged by the progress that was being made, but she knew that the fight was far from over. She continued to work with the coalition, pushing for policies that would address the root causes of healthcare disparities and ensure that all patients received the care they deserved. Throughout all of this, Sandra remained grounded by the support of her family and friends. James continued to be her biggest cheerleader, and her children, now young adults, expressed pride in the work their mother was doing. Sandra knew that her story was not just her own. It was a story that belonged to her entire family, to her community, and to everyone who had ever been dismissed or mistreated by the healthcare system. As Sandra's work continued to expand, she also began to think about the future. She knew that there would come a time when she would need to step back and let others take the lead. But for now, she was focused on the present, on the work that still needed to be done. She remained committed to the cause, determined to see the changes she had fought for become a reality. Dr. Spencer, meanwhile, continued his own journey of self-reflection and growth. The experience with Sandra had fundamentally changed him, and he was determined to become a better doctor because of it. He took on a mentoring role within the hospital, working with younger doctors and medical students to help them understand the importance of empathy, cultural competency, and patient-centered care. It was a humbling experience, but one that Dr. Spencer embraced fully. As the years passed, Dr. Spencer became known as an advocate for healthcare reform within the medical community. He used his platform to speak out against the very biases that had once influenced his practice, and he encouraged others to do the same. It was a difficult journey, but one that Dr. Spencer knew was necessary if he wanted to make amends for the harm he had caused. He was committed to being a part of the solution, to helping create a healthcare system that truly served all patients. Sandra and Dr. Spencer's paths crossed again at a national healthcare conference where both were invited to speak. Sandra's speech focused on the need for continued advocacy and reform, while Dr. Spencer spoke about his own journey of growth and the lessons he had learned from his experience with Sandra. It was a powerful moment, one that highlighted the impact that one patient's voice could have on the entire healthcare system. Sandra's journey had been long and challenging, but it had also been deeply rewarding. She had turned her pain and frustration into a powerful force for change, and she had seen the impact of her work on a national scale. But through it all, Sandra remained humble, always reminding herself that the fight was far from over. There were still countless patients who needed advocates like her, who needed someone to stand up and speak out on their behalf. As Sandra reflected on her journey, she was struck by the power of resilience. The resilience of patients who refused to be silenced, of healthcare providers who were willing to learn and grow, and of communities that came together to demand change. She knew that her work was just one part of a larger movement, and she was proud to be a part of it. The success of Sandra's advocacy efforts led to new opportunities and challenges. She was invited to join the board of several national healthcare organizations, where she worked alongside other leaders to push for systemic reform. These roles gave Sandra a new perspective on the complexities of healthcare policy, and she was eager to use her experience to help shape the future of the industry. Sandra's work also began to attract the attention of the media, and she found herself giving interviews and participating in documentaries about healthcare disparities. These opportunities allowed Sandra to reach an even wider audience, and she was grateful for the chance to share her story and advocate for change. But with the increased visibility came new challenges, including criticism from those who opposed the reform she was fighting for. Despite the challenges, Sandra remained focused on her mission. She knew that the work she was doing was important, and she was determined to see it through. She continued to travel, speak, and advocate, always keeping the needs of patients at the forefront of her work. Sandra knew that change was possible, but it would take time, persistence, and the collective effort of many. As Sandra's story continued to unfold, she found herself thinking more about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. She knew that her work would outlast her, and she wanted to ensure that future generations of patients and healthcare providers would continue the fight for equity and justice. Sandra began mentoring young advocates, sharing her knowledge and experience with those who were just beginning their journey. She was inspired by their passion and determination, and she knew that the future of the movement was in good hands. James continued to be Sandra's unwavering support, reminding her of the importance of taking time for herself and for their family. Together, they found moments of joy and relaxation amidst the demands of Sandra's work. They traveled, spent time with their children, and enjoyed the simple pleasures of life. Sandra knew that her work was important, but she also knew that it was essential to maintain balance and to cherish the moments of peace and happiness that life had to offer. As the years passed, Sandra's impact on the healthcare system became undeniable. She had played a crucial role in bringing about meaningful change, and her story had inspired countless others to take action. But Sandra knew that the fight was far from over. There were still disparities to address, still patients who needed advocates like her. She remained committed to the cause, knowing that her work was making a difference, one step at a time. Dr. Spencer, too, continued to evolve as a healthcare provider and advocate. He had learned from his mistakes, and he was determined to use his experience to help others. He continued to mentor young doctors, to speak out against bias in healthcare, and to push for reforms that would ensure that all patients received the care they deserved. Dr. Spencer knew that his journey was ongoing, but he was committed to the work, knowing that each day brought new opportunities to make a positive impact. Sandra and Dr. Spencer's journeys had been intertwined, and while they had started from a place of pain and injustice, they had both emerged stronger, more compassionate, and more determined to create a better healthcare system. Their stories were a testament to the power of resilience, of the human capacity to grow, learn, and make a difference. As Sandra looked to the future, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had faced challenges, but she had also achieved great things. Her work had made a difference, and she was proud of the legacy she was leaving behind. But Sandra knew that the fight for healthcare equity was far from over, and she was ready to continue the work, knowing that each step forward brought them closer to a healthcare system that truly served everyone. Dr. Spencer, too, was ready to continue his journey, knowing that the lessons he had learned would guide him as he worked to create a more just and equitable healthcare system. He was grateful for the opportunity to make amends, to grow, and to contribute to the change that Sandra and so many others were fighting for. Together, Sandra and Dr. Spencer represented the power of resilience, the ability to learn, grow, and make a difference. Their stories were a reminder that change was possible, that even the most entrenched systems could be transformed through the efforts of individuals who were willing to stand up, speak out, and fight for what was right. And with each step forward, they were helping to create a better, more equitable world for all.